I am going to hand off now to Patrick Corvington. Patrick is a Writer Center board member. He's a writer himself, along with many other, I'm not going to go through the whole bio right now, but an accomplished man, and we're really grateful that he's on our board and really grateful that he came to us wanting to do this event with us, because this is really exciting. And we thank you, Patrick. Please take the floor.
There, I'm unmuted. I control my own voice. I was saying Zach is being modest. He's a recently published author himself. I really encourage you to take a look at his book, First Cosmic Velocity from Penguin. And I read that one as well. It's truly a fascinating, complicated story that's worth a good read. But what we're here today is to talk with my old and dear friend, Anissa Bouziane. We grew up together years ago in Morocco and have remained such close friends over the years. And we're here to talk about Dune Song, her first novel, that for those who haven't taken a look at it, I so recommend, because it deals with so many issues around trauma, identity, somebody who witnesses the coming down of the towers, 9/11, goes back to Morocco, experiences her own journey through her own identity and for trauma. I mean, it's a beautifully written book. The prose is absolutely captivating. But let me first introduce my friend Anissa, who has such an interesting background. Born from a French mother, a Moroccan father, born in Tennessee, grew up in Morocco with us, came to Wellesley in the States, went to France, came back, went to Columbia, got an MFA, did some short films for a while. In fact, my sister worked in one of her early films, then taught in New York, witnessed The Fall of the Towers, and then moved to Paris, where she's been for many, many years. And we're delighted to have you with us, Anissa. And I thought we could just first start with your thoughts, how you're doing. You know, I seem to start all these conversations, given the time we're in, with, so how are you doing in this time? And let's just start there.
Thank you, Patrick, for inviting me. It means the world to me that I should be there in DC, because in addition to everything, I'm also very connected to the Washington, DC area, because I spent some of my early childhood there. Yes, I was born in Tennessee, not too far from where Barbara's parents lived in Alabama, actually. And that's another story that I might write a novel about one day. But my father was a Moroccan diplomat in Washington, DC, so I grew up in DC till I was 8. And then after I graduated from Wellesley, I moved down to the Washington area and lived in Georgetown for 4 years, where, of course, once again, the Corvingtons became extremely important in my life. So I'm delighted to be here. How am I feeling? My sister Yasmina used to live in the Congo, which of course so did Pat. But Yasmina was working for the UN in the Congo during the time of the civil war there. And she taught me this amazing term that when you asked people in Kinshasa how they were doing during the time of the civil war, they would say in French, I'm doing je vais bien malgré, which means I'm doing okay despite. I mean, obviously, you can't say we're doing well when we're suffering, the consequences of a global pandemic. But given the spectrum of what's possible, I'm okay. And I've invited you here into my apartment, which happens to be the very same apartment my great-grandmother moved into in 1908. So for someone who, during an enormous part of her life, felt like she was wandering, I've kind of come home in a way that is extremely important. And we'll talk later about notions of home and sense of space. And I've spoken about this before, but I have been confined in the very same space that my great-grandmother was confined in during the pandemic of 1918. So I feel that somehow or another I'm connected to my ancestors in ways I never have been before. Voila. But right now I'm actually thrilled to, in a way, connect back to that part of me that was deeply rooted in DC for many years.
Thank you. It's a great place to start. But a quick note, Zach, I'm getting a few texts from some folks who are having trouble connecting. I'm wondering if you could resend the Zoom link for folks who might want to call in. So that's a great place to start, Anissa, in terms of where you're rooted from 1908 until now, and how you've traveled the world, not just physically, but you and I have talked quite a bit about cultural identity and about people like us who are made up of sort of multi-ethnic, multi-identities, multi-experiences, sometimes have trouble both defining ourselves and being defined. And Jahan has that experience in your novel as well. And I would love for you to just talk, start there, which is, when I describe you as a French Moroccan, an Arab woman, a Muslim woman, an American woman, a writer who lives in English fluently, who lives in French fluently, who lives in Arabic fluently, how does that all come together into a definition?
Brilliant question. So I'm going to plug the book. Here it is, the American version published by Interlink Publishing, Dune Song. The protagonist of Dune Song is named Jihan Nathar, loosely translates as Fragments of the World. There was a reason why I chose that name. I see Sally Constein nodding. She and I often talked about the importance of the names we give our characters in our fiction. The issue of identity and belonging has been one of extreme importance to me because of this multifaceted nature of the places that I can call mine. As children, some of the questions that are posed to us end up being seminal in our sense of belonging or not belonging, and how we see ourselves. And so I gave all of these questions to Jihan. So many people will say, is it an autobiographical book? The answer is no, except I have infused a great deal of myself, in some cases my own personal experiences, but profoundly why Jihan feels like me is because I have given her a lot of the identity issues that have inhabited me and continue to be at the heart of how I feel about myself in the world. Okay, so I'll tell a little anecdote that you'll find interesting and you might resonate with you, Pat. When we returned to Morocco from the United States and I was 8 years old, I was playing in the Dar es Salaam swimming pool with Yasmina, and we were, of course, speaking in English and jumping around in the pool. And the little Moroccan girl turns around to me and asks me in French, okay, why are you speaking English? Are you English? And just before I dive into the pool, I say, no, I'm not English, I'm American. And by the time I come out of the pool, they're all chanting, liar, liar, I know you're Moroccan, your dad's Moroccan. Okay. And that would always been a part. I remember crying and going to daddy and say, but I'm not lying. That was a piece of me. And I tell you this anecdote because the notion that I might have been lying because I didn't affirm my Moroccanness in the moment when I was questioned about my language was foundational to my saying, how can I come to terms with all the different facets of myself? And what I came to understand was that I couldn't reject any different piece or any particular piece, that I had to create a puzzle that was a combination of all the different fragments, and that I needed the world to accept them as well. Because if I didn't accept them, then I would be at war with myself. And if the world didn't accept them, one, wouldn't feel at ease in the world, and for two, I might be at war with the world. And so this is so important to my personal sense of self. I gave these issues to Jihan so that through my fiction, I might be able to explore it and in turn, allow a reader to explore it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think, you know, in my reading of Dune Song, that comes through so beautifully. There's this notion of traveling and traversing your own identity, but also informed by trauma. And so I also want to go there because you lived through the fall of the towers, 9/11, and that's part of what infuses this book is Jahan's travel back and trying to understand her own trauma. You know, at that time, you wrote a couple of beautiful essays about what it was like to be a Muslim woman living in New York when the towers came down. And then you've also written about what it's like to be a Muslim woman, an Arab woman in Paris when discrimination against the Maghrebians and was so prevalent, is so prevalent. And so can you talk a little bit about why you decided to tell the story about Jahan and her experience going back as relates to your own personal experience around the trauma of 9/11, but then also, you know, she is also part French, and as are you, and so your experience as a Maghrebian living in Paris.
Okay, so the issue of sort of my Frenchness is in, and how I articulate my diversity in the context of my Frenchness. I will speak about only this much because it's actually at the heart of my second novel. Okay, so I don't want to reveal too much of that. But what's interesting is to not lose the very important issue of 9/11. When I wrote about Muslim Arab identity in the French context, it happened to be around the issue of the Charlie Hebdo terrorist attacks and the Bataclan attacks, because I lived through those in Paris and I tragically lost friends in the Bataclan attack, and I was within earshot of the gunfire that day. And then I had to teach in a civics class at my school while in the midst of the week when all of that was happening. So I've written about it because I realized that it, though I had fled New York in the wake of 9/11, that something about the world we live in makes that there is no safe space where you can run away, where I could run away from my trauma. And so part of why I wrote Dune Song was because, having been a witness to the collapse of the towers that day, having been traumatized to not as much as if I had been in the towers. And I do not claim to have been a victim in either of the towers that day, but I did physically see them fall. And I did walk through a dust, ash-covered New York on that day. And I believe that the ripples of trauma that emanated from Ground Zero are things that we actually still deal with today. Just like the trauma of the COVID pandemic touches each of us in different ways. I have been thus far spared from the trauma of losing anyone to any dear person in my family or in my friends to COVID. And but I know friends who are long haulers. My life has been transformed by the pandemic. I still teach remotely because of it. Likewise, the pandemic sends ripples of trauma at varying degrees. So having been a witness to the collapse of the towers on 9/11, I wanted to give that trauma to Jahan so that in the process of working through that trauma in the context of the fiction, I might come to terms with it, and maybe I might come to some modicum of understanding about it that I might share with the reader. And what's interesting is that dealing with trauma, even through generations, is so important to me that my next novel deals with trauma through 5 generations of women, and that I've gone back to school recently and I'm doing a PhD at the University of Warwick where I'm writing a novel and I'm doing research on trauma and memory. So what I'm fascinated by is how we cope with trauma, how we inherit reactions to trauma. And so I needed to deal with my own trauma by giving it to Jihan, and maybe hopefully producing a work. It isn't a work about 9/11 in so much as it is a work about how our world was inexorably changed by that event. I believe that September 11th has become the smoldering backdrop of our 21st century, and that unless we understand it, we won't necessarily have all the tools to understand the ripples that continue, the ripples of trauma that continue to work themselves through our present.
You know, I want to rest there for a second, because you've said that to me before, and I'd like you to dig a little bit deeper, because right now, you know, we're living with a generation of folks, because 9/11 was 20 years ago. And so for many of us, it's something that is so prevalent in our lives, but there's a whole generation of folks who didn't have that experience. And I'm reminded of this because I know a lot of young folks from China, for example, who grew up beyond Tiananmen Square. And for that, which for us in college was such a big moment, right? And years later, 9/11. And the sense of how young generations live absent the personal context of global trauma has always been fascinating to me. And so when you say that it's the smoldering backdrop, say a little bit more about why you think that's the case, but also the effects of that experience for the world, and also for people, how that plays out now.
Okay, a couple of things. There are a few people in our group right now who are my students here in Paris. Daniel, hi, thanks for being here. Many of them were born in 2005 or something like that. 9/11 is part of history for them. And yet, the world as they know it has been shaped by that event. Okay, so that we cannot, I think, I was thinking about this before we started our talk today. 9/11 was the first global trauma that was shared almost in real time because of the nature of our 24-hour cable news cycle, almost in real time by everyone present on planet Earth that day. Okay, so that yes, Jihan, I give her the witness that I had to seeing the first plane hit, the second plane hit, the towers fall one after the other. That the knowledge that I had of the smell of death in the air at ground zero, that's something that many people, and especially let's say Daniel's generation, that is not part of their lived experience in any way, shape, or form. And yet I believe that having shared on a planetary level the notion that we've sort of, we all know about this event that traumatized the world because it traumatized America. I think the world changed because America changed that day, and America is continuing to change. And one of the things that I say in Dune Song is that as Jihan walked up through Central Park that day, she suddenly had the sense that America was no longer a place free, sort of like that was on the yellow brick road to the land of Oz, and that in fact, the difficulties that, or images associated with the old world, be it the lines of refugees in Kosovo or during the Second World War and the like, that all of a sudden these images became part of a contemporary American consciousness in ways that brought America in line with the horrors of the rest of the world. Not to say that slavery and the genocide of Native peoples in America was not, hadn't already done that, but it had been erased from American consciousness in many ways. Mm-hmm. So what I believe is that this globalization of collective trauma is something today we live on an even larger scale, in the sense that our pandemic means that you can ask me, how am I doing in the time of COVID? Anyone else on our panel, they will know exactly what I'm talking about when I speak of my experience. I would know what they were talking about when they speak of their experience. And if we ask anybody from Borneo all the way to, to Alaska, they will all know. And I think that's where something happened in 9/11 that opened up a door to a different experience of globalization of trauma. And I think the problem is we now know how to deal with that, but we're still dealing with trying to remedy that with a vocabulary and a prism from another age that doesn't acknowledge what happened to our worldview. And therefore, we are drowning in a sectarian identity type of a situation where we're trying to block instead of open up and globalize the sharing of our human experience. I think, for me, the notion that we live on a planet that is a spinning blue jewel in the darkness of the universe often inhabits me. I think this jewel is multifaceted, and in all of its beautiful facets, those are the differences in our identity. They do not change the fact that we live on this jewel of a planet. And if we found a way to celebrate our communalities and understand that we are part of a whole that we must preserve, and we cannot guarantee that preservation will happen. And so what I think is that events like COVID pandemic and 9/11 globalized our trauma without globalizing our notion of our humanity.
That's I've known you
I
for
just
so
said,
many years.
just popped out of my
I've
head.
known you
Whatever.
for so long, and I am always laid bare by your intellect. Truly, always laid bare by your intellect. So, these themes that you brought together, you just raised, in many ways are distilled in the novel. And so many of these experiences are brought together at their core in Jahan. And, from moving the process, because so many folks on this call are writers. I mean, there's so much there to be distilled into a story, into a character. Mm-hmm. So from a process perspective, I'm curious about the level of both intellectual and emotional distilling that has to happen to take all of this and create from it a story.
Okay, this is cool. Good question, which of course I've known you for so long. I know you ask good questions. So by the way, there's also a British version because it was published in Britain, Sandstone Press. I have to shout out to my editor at Sandstone, Maura Forsyth, extraordinary person. And without my agent, Claire Roberts, I would have never met Moira, and this book wouldn't exist the way it does. Sable is the French version. We'll talk about all of this. And it was published in French in an earlier version by Les Éditions Le Fennec in Casablanca. So,
we're going to talk about all that. Don't worry. We're going to get to all of that.
Yeah. All of this, because I'm actually flipping through. I think not everyone's read Dune Song, so I got to read some of it in order to be able to talk about this. Now, I know some of you have already been to either my readings in person when I did my book launch in the US or virtual readings. And so I'm not going to bore you by reading the same thing I usually read. Okay, but if you have read the book, and if you do know the prologue by heart, I'm actually going to read a passage that echoes the prologue, and that speaks about how I take my lived experience and transmute it into the poetics of my prose, because I do like to play with sort of prose poetry. And also a shout out to Elion, because recently he read the book and he actually took a photo of this passage and said to me, wow. So let's hope you guys wow too. I don't know, I've never read it out loud to anybody before. So, put myself at risk. So it's actually passage 52. So you all know the book alternates between Morocco and New York City. Morocco, well, New York City in the immediate 9/11, immediate aftermath of 9/11. Morocco, about 8 months afterwards, Jihan returns to Morocco. The book begins with a prologue whose first line I will share with you. The line is simply, "I came to the Sahara to be buried." Okay, now I plant this, I describe something that sounds like a burial. It plays with sound and musicality, and you're supposed to not know exactly if the narrator who's speaking to you, because it's written in first person, is dead or not. Okay, so then it isn't until chapter 52, page 239, that you come back with a circular form. Is super important to me. It's fragmented form, but I play with it the way one would the construction of a musical piece. So musical composition is important to me. And so here the circularity is such that we find ourselves not only again at the top of the dune in which Jihan is being buried, but there's also echo of some of the same phrases that are used. Let me read and then I'll tell you more. And yes, Pat, I will answer your question. When the weight of the sand had begun to restrict even the slightest of my movements, when neither arm nor hip could thrust against the mass of sand above, leaving no space for the rivulets of sweat purling off my skin, panic raced through me like a chilling current, the primeval fear of an unnatural burial. I could have shouted. I could have tried to summon some superhuman strength to lift myself up and out of my near grave, but instead I chose stillness. Was it the immobility of the squirrel, aware too late of the claws of the falcon? Or was it the renunciation of a man overboard who, with his drowning breath, understands that he and the oceans are now one? Regardless of reason, the result was that as the minutes ticked by, as the sun measured its way through the heavens, I awakened to the awareness that I did not want to be unearthed. Okay. So I take this passage because on many different layers, the writing of it was a distillation of lived experiences at a host of different variety of periods in my life. Because I think that as a writer, what I do is that I look at the world and I try to find meaning in it, to try and make sense of my own personal experience, especially in moments of intense emotion, whether fear or joy or sorrow. And so many will say to me, was I buried in the dune in the way that Jihan was? And the answer is yes. Okay, but not the way Jihan was, in the sense that I like to live things intensely, and I was kind of nutty. I went to the desert with some girlfriends, and they told me that in Merzouga, where this takes place, in the highest dune, if the people at the end of the day go and just like you would take the hot waters at a spring, they bury each other in the dune for a few minutes, and it helps if you have rheumatism. So I decided that in the middle of August at noon, I would undertake this thing. And it is true that because we were a whole bunch of us and they were giggling and laughing, they kind of forgot me. And at one point, I started tripping in this dune, and I came out of it with lots of weird kinds of sensations that I later distilled and gave to Jihan, okay? But then there are other things, like when I describe the squirrel and the claws of the falcon, I remember distinctly, and Yazzie will remember this too, at a period when I was very sad in my life, living in New York before 9/11, walking in Riverside Park and seeing a squirrel just absolutely frozen and shaking imperceptibly on the bark of a tree. And I'm wondering what was wrong with this animal. And all of a sudden I looked up and there was a falcon just about to strike. And the nature of the fear in that animal suddenly communicate, it's something I imbibed, and I never, ever forgot that. And one day, trying to understand what might Jehan have felt as she was dealing with her fear, because the trauma that Jehan deals with was this fear of death. It's seeing so many people die in an instant in front of her. How do you deal with that proximity with death? And I remembered the squirrel. And then about the man overboard, I actually, yeah, I guess I'm a Renaissance person. I do a lot of things. I spent a semester at sea when I was at Wellesley. I did the Williams Mystic Seaport program. And one night at 3 a.m, I go to take salinity and temperature checks in the water. It was right after Hurricane Gloria. That dates me, okay? And I forgot to put my harness on. And I get hit by an enormous wave, and in the fraction of a second, I'm inside the wave. I do not know if I have been swept overboard or not. I am simply in the wave. And in that fraction of a second, I had a notion that everything was at peace and I was at one with the ocean. And then two fractions of a second later, I hit the side of the lab and I was on deck. And what I first remember when I hit the side of the deck was disappointment, because I had lost that sense of eternity, eternal oneness with the world. It was something that I knew I would use in my writing one day. It took me 25 years. So, and I only, though at the time I thought I'm going to write an entire book about my experience at sea. That might still come, but I have to maybe live to be 120. But I put it there because it was something about I had understood something about the nature of my place in the world. And I give that to Jehan. And this is what I mean about taking lived experiences in ways that are not purely autobiographical.
Right. Yeah.
Which brings us to my purpose for writing is not to be published or to be known, even though at some point you gotta be published, but we can cross that bridge when we get there about, are you a writer if you're not published? I mean, for a gazillion years, I used to laugh and say I was the most prolific unpublished writer I knew. And my friends like Caroline, who's smiling, no.
Okay. Actually, let's go there right away, Anissa, which is, this book was 10 years in the making in terms of the writing, but a lifetime in the making in terms of your experiences. Mm-hmm. You came to a point when you were writing this book, and I remember it, where the writing process and the business of writing came together, and how Claire, your agent, really was transformative in that process. I think as writers, we think about this quite a bit, which is what you just spoke to. Is writing about publishing, or is it about writing? And you've taught writing for years, both in English and in French. So when you talk to your students, what do you tell them about process, about publishing, where those two come together?
Okay, so I teach writing at a variety of different levels, okay? I have taught, when I first knew Sally Constein, we were teaching writing to primary school children, okay? I have taught middle school. I currently teach high school. I have taught writing at the Harvard Summer Program in Paris, okay? And I have taught established writers writing workshops at the American Library in Paris. So I think intent when it comes to writing is different depending on what period you are in your life. And yet, one of the fundamental things that teaching writing to kindergarten students has taught me is that as human beings, we seek to create story in order to make sense of our lives. And then, in addition, our humanity is intrinsically tied to the sharing of those stories. That as human beings, we grow when we're able to share our stories with others. Now, does that have to be within the context of publication? I, for a long time, was terrified of publication. I went to Columbia's master's program in fiction writing, and I think the egos that I encountered there were so much larger than my own at the time that I felt that I emerged from the program having lost my determination to battle it amongst those who achieve publication. And ultimately, I lost my voice and was able to find it again only in the classroom. So for me, the act of teaching writing keeps me true, keeps me real. Why do I write? Why? And for example, today I gave my 10th graders a writing exercise about place. Okay, and my whole spiel about the world and the globe and our common humanity really emerges, now that I think of it, out of what I ended up writing during my timed writing exercise there. Because the day before, I had done a similar exercise where I had written about the Hungarian pastry shop, like my favorite place. Half of Dune Song is set there, right? But then today, I don't know why, I ended up writing about planet Earth as a place, okay? And, but doing that without having the objective of publishing allows me to nourish my intellect, my heart, my understanding of who I am in the world. And so today, or a few hours later, it comes out of me as that comment I just gave you. So the act of writing for me is about understanding my place in the world, my interaction with other human beings. And that is what the teaching of writing has always taught me, because I learned something from teaching writing. Every day I do. And as a result, it keeps me true as a writer. Okay, that doesn't mean that the writing becomes any easier. This second novel I'm working on, oh my God, it's so hard. Okay, you'd think I would know what I'm doing. After all, my first novel is published in 4 languages, but I don't know what I'm doing. I feel like I'm reinventing the wheel, but that's what it's about, isn't it? It's not, it's about a craft that involves a way of being in the world. Does that answer some of what
it does. I mean, in a beautiful way. You know, and sticking with that theme a little bit in terms of process and language. You know, prose is painting, prose is music. And painting and music happen in different ways. But the thing about prose is that it can occur in different languages. And you and I and many others on this call are fluent in many different voices, many different languages, and we express ourselves in different languages. Your novel was published in English and in French, and presumably resonates in different ways. So I have 2 questions for you. One is, how do you think the book is received in France versus in English-speaking communities, but also when you're living in French? So when we're talking amongst ourselves in French versus in English, for example, or with your family and friends in Arabic, do you show up in a different way? Does your sense of self change or alter slightly by the language in which you're operating, both in writing and in speak and voice?
Yes. But that, so let's go back to that, you know, jewel metaphor. Those different parts of me are different facets of a whole, okay? But they are certainly something that I wanted to express in Dune Song, and that I must admit, I didn't learn how to do right away. Part of why I was crushed at Columbia when doing my MFA, and why I put the 200 pages I wrote of that first novel that still is in a desk drawer somewhere and never published it is because I was trying to do what I now have a name for, and I didn't even know how to do it before, is I call it linguistic polyphony, okay? Where I write, fiction demands that you take one language and you stick to it, okay? Whether it be French, whether it be English, Arabic, or whatever other language you're writing in. So how do I take an experience that in my life and in my head exists in 3 different languages? Because I gave so much of my multicultural identity to Jihan, so she lives in English, in French, and in Arabic. And how do I distill that and give you, the reader, the impression? How do I stage the simulacra of the fact that you are hearing French and Arabic when you're reading in English?
Yeah.
Okay.
That is really I just want to rest with that for a second as it relates to my earlier question about how you show up differently in different languages. That is, I think, something that's so unique in this book, is that you are reading in English a different language being spoken. And so just from a perspective of craft, how did you do that?
Okay, so this is, I'm going to give you an example because we could talk intellectually about this forever and you're like, well, wow, what does it mean? I am, after all, going to read to you part of the prologue and part of the first chapter because they so dramatically illustrate what I'm talking to you about. And then on the other side of that, I'll tell you something that my editor, Maura Forsyth, said to me when she read it initially, okay? I came to the Sahara to be buried, to let the rough hands of women I did not know, with their black jalabas flapping in the desert wind, guide me naked across the burning sands of Lel Alia, the highest dune in the Moroccan desert. To let them ease me into the shallow pit they had dug for me only moments earlier. I came to the desert to feel the heat from every grain of sand press against the soles of my feet, my spine, my shoulder blades, my arms and neck, every inch of me scorched by the refracted fire of the sun. My exodus from New York was never meant to lead me to this burial ceremony atop the stateliest of the Moroccan dunes. Yet at long last, for the first time since the towers fell, all seemed clear to me as the women began to throw shovelful after shovelful of hot sand over my body, and I sensed every grain like so many tiny branding irons against my skin. Grain after grain, my body was covered, and every time a woman heaved sand up and onto me, she called out in Arabic, "This girl comes from the ends of the earth." And the others sang back, "Qabliha ya lil Alia," accept her, O saintly Alia. So it continues, but you got a sense of the sound and the musicality of it. Then you don't get to very far, and this is what it sounds like. As time passed, the image that came back to me most frequently from that second Tuesday in September was a newspaper bearing the headlines from the New York Post, Michael Jordan, get a life. So that narrator, the 2 voices, the Morocco voice and the New York voice, are the same person, okay? And for the longest time, people were having difficulty with this book because of the dissonance between these 2 voices. But anybody who knows me knows that if you meet me at the Hungarian pastry shop in New York, I'm going to talk like I make Jihan talk. And then if you meet me au Café de la Paix in Tangiers, I'm going to sound much more lyrical because those are parts of me. And today, if I sound slightly different, it's because I'm in Paris. And so, yes, so why not sound like Simone de Beauvoir? Okay? So, and I desperately wanted to do that. And then the other thing is, how do I create the the lilt of Arabic. I
Mhm.
throw in some words, and then I explain them the first time, then you're supposed to learn them, and then I never explain them anymore because now you're speaking Arabic. Okay. And because I could have done a glossary or whatever, and that would have alienated people. So I don't do that. Okay. And at one point, Moira Forsyth, my editor, said to me, Anissa, this stuff in New York reads really easily. Okay. The stuff in Morocco, did you write it in Arabic? And I loved that she asked me that, because the answer is, of course not. I wrote it in English, but I want you to get the sense that you're hearing it in another language. And so even at one point she says to me, what is the deal with adjectives in the Morocco passage? I'm like, you throw in like 3 adjectives. 1 is enough in English. I'm like, have you ever read Arabic poetry? Okay. And you know, there are 100 words for God in Arabic. Okay. So, so language becomes the vehicle for also for cultural transmission. And these are things I have imbibed, and that they are parts of me. So now, for those who are interested in literary translation, the act of translating my book into French was a Herculean feat. I did not do it. I didn't find that I actually thought it would sound like a translation if I did it. I also, my imagination constructs itself in English. And so Laurence Larsen did the translation with the help of Eleonore Erscovici for the prologue. And what the translation does is flip that. You read in French and you get the impression you're hearing English, and you get the impression you're hearing Arabic. It's not an easy thing to do.
Well, that's what I was about to ask you is the lyricism of language that you employ in having one person, Jahan, speak in different language and express herself in different ways, given that language, as you do personally.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how does that show up in translation? I mean, you know, if you're reading a French passage versus a passage in English, they're going to sound different. But as you say, it's almost like a triple translation. You know, I think of it as playing classical guitar on an electric guitar. It has to just weave in different ways that still captures the essence of the message and of the lyricism while being heard in a different way. And I just wonder how you navigate that.
Okay, so one of the things that happens, at one point, Laurence calls me and says, Anissa, is it okay if I use the passé simple? Now, the passé simple, for those of you who are into French conjugation, is a totally erudite, old-fashioned past tense that, you know, Rousseau and Voltaire mastered, but today fewer and fewer contemporary French writers write in the passé simple, okay? And I said, tell me why you want to do this, okay? Because I said to her, Anissa does not use the passé simple when she writes French, okay? She said, yes, but there's something you're doing with your English when it goes into those very lyrical moments. She says, in French, I cannot find it unless I go to a slightly obscure verb form, which of course I said to her, yes. Okay. And that's where I realized I was right to have someone else translate it, because I would not have done that, because then I would have collapsed the space between Anissa and Jehan, okay, which I don't do in my English, because the truth of the matter, and this is important for people to know, French might be my mother tongue, and my Arabic is my father's language. And I have said, in those who know my experimental film work, there's one of my films where the text, Yazzie and I actually used to make films together, but there's a line where I say, did I cross the sea to find a home for my words? Okay, and I do think it's because English has always been my secret garden. and my notion of belonging to America is something that happens through language, and that I actually use and am capable of using English in ways that are far more sophisticated than I use my mother tongue or my father's language.
Mhm.
And when
You
I
know,
teach, the interesting thing is, for those of you who are my students who are still around, I always say, so I teach English as a second language to people that I hope by using creative writing as a form of to help them master the English language, I tell them, English I took not from my father nor from my mother. It is mine, and that I lay claim to that territory, to that landscape. And I'm proud of the fact that I'm able to write in English in ways that do not reveal in any way, shape, or form that I might not have had that language accessible to me in my cradle.
that is a fascinating concept, Anissa. I want to switch gears, but I want to rest on that for a second. The notion of, for those of us who learn English either early or later in life, who might not be experienced by the world as non-native English speakers, I think about my parents as well, that English is really our own, right? And that part of our connection to America, to being American, to becoming American, has to do with a language that is ours versus our parents or our ancestors. And I think that's such a fascinating concept that I hadn't thought of. Again, you opened my mind. I want to switch gears now to something much more practical as we wrap up. That I ask of all writers. Everybody I know says, in passing, I ought to write a book about that someday. Or everybody I know has an unfinished novel somewhere in their drawer. You mentioned that you write, and somebody says, "Oh, I write too. I started a novel 25 years ago. I'm still working on it. One day I'll finish that novel." And the number of times I've heard, "One day I'll finish that novel," it makes me ask all writers who have accomplished a certain amount of writing is, what gets in the way?
Oh my goodness. Let's meet and give me an hour. I'll tell you. And I know from my friends here who have known me in this process, who they themselves have been in the process, what actually takes you to the point where you cross the Rubicon and you are able to let go. Because so there are a couple of things going on with me. Part of it is I'm actually fascinated by, there's a one word in French that comes to mind, l'inachevé, the unfinished, but in French it's so much more, it encompasses more. L'inachevé is the work that is not finished. Rodin, for example, was known for leaving us countless statues that are inachevé. There is a beauty in l'inachevé, and I think at some point I became la reine de l'inachevé, the queen of the unfinished work. Okay, ta-da. The only reason why I did some stuff in cinema, and I started working with my sister in cinema, is I was so blocked that at least I thought, well, maybe Yazzie can carry me across the finish line. I can't do it on my own. But I think it was ultimately, I think I was hard on myself, and that if you are amongst those people, and do not judge yourself too harshly. But my dad, who's now 94, admitted to me not too long ago, once my novel got published, that my mentor at Columbia, the late, great Dean Aaron Warner, had met with my father and told him face to face, Anissa has the potential to be a writer of portent in the English language. The question is, how much does she want it? Okay, and Sally and others knew Dean Warner. And the interesting thing is he never told me, okay? And I think he never told me because it was ultimately to be my choice. And he also didn't tell me because when Dean Warner passed away, I was the one who put away the boxes of 5 books he had never finished. Okay, so he spoke of it not from the pedestal of an accomplished man who has written and published, but from an accomplished man who has written and not published. Okay, and so what he was saying is that there is an element ultimately of luck, yes. There is also an element of perseverance. And one cannot control luck. That I met Claire Roberts when I did was an element of luck, okay? Also, I knew of her existence 3 years before I met her. I knew I had only one shot to send her to send her a manuscript, and I waited. Okay, I waited till I thought I had finally come to the end of the line, that the book, I could not make it better than it was. Ultimately, I would work on it much more with Sandstone Press, but I had come to the end of my process alone. But so luck is something that you can't control. But the other thing is you can control perseverance, and you can control the degree to which writing is a serious act in your life, whether you are published or not. The number of notebooks I fill on a daily basis become a monthly basis, become a yearly basis, become those of a lifetime. Okay. When I was living in DC, I thought I was going to be an attorney. I actually was a legal assistant at Steptoe and Johnson in Sutherland, Asheville. And as I was walking down to the post office, at the time it was by post office that you mailed your law school applications, I had a ton of them. And I turned around from the Georgetown post office and I didn't mail them. And I called my mom and I said, Mommy, you know, the notebooks in the corner of my room, I want to put those at the center of my life. I'm not going to law school. And of course, from across the Atlantic, I could have heard her. I didn't need a telephone, you know, saying how I was wasting my life and all of that. And ultimately, in order to placate her, I decided to go to Columbia School of the Arts and to get a master's degree in fiction writing. That's not a necessary step. There's a lot of argument as to whether or not that dilutes your, the MFA dilutes your voice. And it left me with what I like to call MFA speak, which I had to cure myself and inoculate myself from. It was just this very hyper self-conscious way of writing that sort of severed its connection to the heart. But I learned tons by losing my voice, because ultimately I found it again. So, so you don't need an MFA, you don't need a PhD in creative writing. Those things are important if you want to teach, okay? But writing has to be a part of your life on an everyday basis. And then whether you decide you want to share it with family or with the larger world is a step you take at the moment where, I mean, I held on to this thing because I knew that the early versions weren't equating to what I had in my heart and head. And the product I did send and share with Claire was by no means perfect, but it was the closest approximation I had of what existed in my heart. And that's where you have to be true to yourself, okay? And I was also afraid of publishing, okay? I was afraid of the outside world. I don't know why. I love doing what I'm doing with you guys now, but I was so frightened that the world would reject my book, that the world would not accept what I had to say. And I'm also part of the whole Ines Chevy obsession, is obsession with perfection. And so I was like Penelope with her tapestry, and I would undo, I mean, like I wrote this thing, and like when I totally rewrote it like 25 times. And the first time it was third person, and then it was first person, and then it was a hybrid, half first person, half third person. And, you know, and then the volumes that existed that never ended up in the novel. The first version was 585 pages long. I cut a third of it. I think it's a better book because of it.
Yeah. You know, we have to wrap up, Anissa. But I would say a couple things in closing. One is, had you become an attorney, your prose and ability to weave together a story would have won you many cases. No doubt about that. Juries would have left going, I'm not sure if she's guilty or not, but man, that's a beautiful story. And I do love the concept of, and I think this is, all writers say this, and I think those of us who continue in this endeavor need to internalize it more, which is that writing needs to be a serious act in your life. If you think about the things that are most important to you and that you spend time on, if you want to write and want to write well, then writing has to in fact be a serious act in your life. And you've made it such, and we are all the better for it. So Anissa, thank you so much for your time, for joining us from Paris. This has been sort of a wonderful session. You've taught us so much, not just about writing, not just about the book, but about how to understand our own humanity.
Terrific.
And that we are all so grateful.
Thanks.
Thank you.
One thing, I was just scrolling because when I'm talking, I can't scroll through the comments, but I'm scrolling through a couple of comments, and I want to thank everyone who has written there. I noticed someone mentioned Nancy Houston. I've had the great pleasure of meeting her. I think she's a role model for me, and a role model in a lot of ways. So she writes in French and she writes in English. And I recently went to a talk of hers before the pandemic, where I asked her, because my thing that I'm right now dealing with is that I'm writing a book that's based in France, and I'm writing it in English. And there's so much of it that exists in my head in French. Like, I think I'm going to have to write the French version as well. And so Nancy Houston said to me, actually, you should, because it'll be a different book once you're done with that second writing, which the translation is. So I just wanted to give a shout out to, I couldn't tell who had mentioned that, but thank you for doing that. And I'm just thrilled to have had the chance to speak with you all. And I hope this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship, as in Casablanca, and that I'll have a chance to come back virtually to the Writers Center to talk more about process, because there's a lot more where that came from, and maybe, why not, a writing workshop.
Thank you, Anissa. And again, if you haven't read it, I can't recommend it highly enough. It's a wonderful novel, a wonderful story that if you hear Anissa speak, then you have to hear her write. So thank you, my dear. It's so great to see you, my old friend. Zach, I'm going to turn it back to you.
I'm just going to say thanks again to everyone for joining us today. It has been wonderful to, sometimes I get to plan these events, but the fun thing about not planning them is being surprised along with everyone else about how great something turns out. So Patrick, thanks for booking this. Anissa, thank you for blowing our minds collectively, our collective mind on this. That was a really great chat, and I'm glad I was here.